All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Attentive Healthcare Solutions webinar, How to Make Your NextGen Workflow More Efficient with Defaults and Favorites. My name is Chelsea Grover, and I'm the Marketing Communications Coordinator for Attentive. Before we dive into today's webinar, I'd like to take a moment to explain the process for today's presentation. First, I'd like to mention this webinar will be recorded. We'll send out a copy along with the slides and recording within the next week. Next, for those of you who aren't familiar with Attentive, I wanted to share a bit of who we are with you. We specialize specifically in NextGen healthcare and are passionate about providing solutions for healthcare provider partners, which in turn help them to improve patient care, enhance the patient experience, and maintain a financially healthy practice. To sum it up, we do everything NextGen. We also have two add-on productivity solutions for NextGen, ChartGuard and Refund Manager. Next, I wanted to mention some upcoming webinars that we'll be having. On February 19th, we'll be presenting Maximizing PM Tasking by Mastering the NextGen Worklog. Tasking is one of the most underused tools available in the NextGen Revenue Cycle toolbox. Unfortunately, clients often fail to gain the full value of this powerful tool for a variety of reasons, including that your staff doesn't see the value of tasking, or maybe they're reluctant to change from using reports. They might be overwhelmed by the volume of their tasks in their worklog, or tasks are assigned with little direction on how to actually work them or how to prioritize them. Join us for this webinar where we will address these issues and help you manage the challenges, allowing your staff to take full advantage of this useful tool. We'll send out an invitation to that webinar and our other upcoming webinars a week before each webinar, so make sure to keep your eyes out for those. Okay, so back to today's presentation on using defaults and favorites to make your NextGen workflow more efficient. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor up to questions from you, but we'll answer all the questions at the end, but you can type them in the questions area of the webinar control panel whenever they occur to you. And finally, for audio clarity purposes, everyone's phone will remain muted throughout the entire webinar. If you experience audio issues, please use the chat box to let us know so we can resolve them. And again, questions may be entered in the questions box. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Lindsay Lanning is Manager of Client Development, Lexi DeMarche is Manager of Consultant Development, and Cindy Kincaid is Vice President of Consulting Solutions at Attentive. So Lindsay, the webinar is all yours. Feel free to get started when you're ready.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Chelsea, and hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar, How to Make Your NextGen Workflow More Efficient with Defaults and Favorites. I see a lot of new faces, or I guess names, I should say, since I can't see any of you, as well as a lot of our veteran webinar attendees as well. So welcome, everyone. Now, whether you've been using NextGen for years now, or maybe you're relatively new to the system, our idea for this webinar is to help you understand how to use NextGen more efficiently with those defaults and favorites. We're going to go about this showing you how to configure NextGen to complement the way you already do your work. And hopefully the idea here is to boost provider satisfaction and then also allow for an overall better user experience. So during this presentation, Cindy and Lexi are going to demonstrate some time-saving preferences and tools available that will hopefully help decrease staff frustration and increase productivity by removing some of those repetitive tasks. While working with our clients, I know over the years, we've come across a multitude of settings and configurations that we have found make NextGen work a lot more effectively for most practices. So before we jump right into sharing those, I do want to relay the importance of these simple actions or settings by taking a step back and looking at the overall bigger picture of why we selected this topic and why we think it's so important. So if we ask ourselves, why do we care? Why are we taking the time today to go over this topic? Yes, it is to make NextGen work better for you and your practice, but it's even bigger than that. And the answer is simple. It's physician burnout. Physician burnout is defined as a long-term stress reaction marked by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a lack of sense of personal accomplishment. I think we all know burnout has been a growing problem for physicians for years now, driven in part by factors such as electronic health records, and of course a shortage of skilled professionals relative to the number of patients. Now, when the National Academy of Medicine released its comprehensive report last October, an estimated 40 to 54% of US physicians reported experiencing burnout. In light of this, burnout is increasingly becoming recognized as a major crisis in healthcare. The report also found that physicians in private practice are actually significantly higher risk for burnout, almost 30% greater. than any physicians in university-based settings. And of course, physicians in specialties with high patient contact, so think family medicine, general internal medicine, and neurology, just to name a few, reported much higher rates of burnout than other disciplines. And yes, while I think we can all agree the issue has gained major attention in recent years, burnout remains to be a significant challenge for physicians. It affects happiness, personal relationships, career satisfaction, and most importantly, patient care. And physician burnout's also expensive. It's costing the US overall about $4.6 billion annually, according to a new study. And if we go off of that 4.6 billion estimate, that means burnout's costing organizations about $7,600 annually per employed physician. So right now, practices are being tasked with identifying the causes and finding solutions to burnout. And a major part of that is improving documentation in the EHR for these end users. Now, according to that Medscape National Physician Burnout and Suicide Report for 2020, the number of burnout clinicians depends heavily on your specialty, but the causes are pretty much universal or pretty much uniform throughout, with the top one being administrative burden, such as charting or documentation into the EHR. We constantly hear providers feel overwhelmed by the workload, and they always feel like they're behind and they're having to catch up on charting at home. We also hear that increasing EHR requirements make physicians feel like they're actually turning into technical people, technicians here. So we know the challenges in healthcare are generally universal. However, one factor that varies by generation, according to that Medscape report, is the stress of using an EHR. So interestingly enough, only the boomer generation mentioned increasing computerization of practice EHRs as one of the top 3 factors contributing to burnout. For millennials, EHR use was the second lowest on the list of 10 potential factors, while too many administrative tasks was cited most often by all 3 age groups. This means it's not the actual EHR that is burning out providers, but all the tasks that they have to complete within it. This is good news for us. This shows that using defaults and favorites or shortcuts that we're going to go over today in NextGen will only help your providers and your staff's experience get better within the EHR and hopefully either remove or speed up those tasks that can lead to burnout. So hopefully the big picture industry side of things didn't bore you or put you to sleep. I tried to keep it short and sweet, which most of you know is pretty hard for me, but instead grabbed your attention and framed up why this topic is so important and why we're talking about it. But I will go ahead and give the people what they want and what you all called in for today and turn it over to our NextGen expert, Lexi DeMarch, to begin by taking you through the EHR defaults and favorites. So Lexi, it is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. So before we go ahead and jump into the actual webinar or the information, I just wanted to mention that we wanted to make this beneficial to everyone. So there is a mix, you'll see, of basic defaults and favorites, and some you might already be aware of, and you might actually already be using them in your practice. But there are plenty of features that you probably haven't seen or maybe just aren't using. So we also included insights from our consulting team, and they are at practice sites every day, and they understand the real-world impact of these features. So with that being said, let's start by jumping in, looking at some of the defaults and favorites that you can find in the EHR application. So the first default that we're going to look at is quick saves. So quick saves will give a user the ability to pre-fill non-patient specific visit information, and then they can save that and use it on a future patient. So we can find this quick save feature in several places in the EHR. So we can see it in places like the reason for visit, review of symptoms, and physical exam panels. These are also available on many procedure templates as well. So quick saves are a provider specific feature, but it's important to note that any user, so not just providers, can actually create new quick saves and modify their own list. So the list of quick saves available is going to be based on the provider selected from the dropdown in the top toolbar of the EHR. So it's important when a user who's not a provider is creating quick saves that they ensure they have the correct provider selected at the top of the screen. So to actually create a quick save, a user would open the pop-up where they want to save defaults. So for example, a provider could default, let's say, routine physical exam. So they would fill in the physical exam template with all the items that they would normally document for that visit. Then on the panel, they would select the floppy disk icon for save, and then this will prompt them to enter a name, and they can save that newly created quick save. And another place that you will see these quick save icons is on the panels themselves. So for example, on the reason for visit panel, we see quick save buttons. And using the buttons here as opposed to the ones on the pop-up will actually allow a user to save multiple pop-up windows, so such as data for multiple HPIs, and it's all under one quick save. So the process to actually apply these quick saves is fairly simple. So a user would just need to navigate to the panel, or they can open a pop-up where they want to apply their defaults. So click the blue circle icon, which is for load, and from the pick list, they would choose the quick save that they want and click OK. So, as you can assume, these quick saves are meant to be generic, so they'll most likely have to add any patient-specific information to complete their documentation. And then if after saving a quick save, the user realizes they want to make any changes, they would go in, they can apply the quick save, you'd make any necessary modifications to that document, and then you would click the save icon. They can choose the same template name from the grid when they go to save it again and click update. And then all of those changes would be available the next time the quick save is used. So provider access to quick saves actually can be modified from the template default setup. That is a system practice template. So that's going to allow you to view who currently has access to each quick save, and then you can also add or remove providers. So if a quick save was created for a user that is not a provider, access is automatically granted to that provider to use that quick save. So this template can also be used to give access to all providers at a practice, so if you want to share those quick saves. So a question that I receive a lot from clients is, can my users create quick saves in a test environment? So a lot of times this is in preparation of an upgrade or a go live. So they want to create them in the test environment and then, obviously use them in production. And so the answer to this is yes, but I will say with the caveat that certain steps have to be taken. So any quick saves that are created in a test environment can be copied to a production environment, and that's using the template import and export utility. So this is an additional step. It's taken during the upgrade or the go live process. So it's important not to assume that this will happen, but I would verify with the person who's performing the upgrade. And speaking of upgrades, we have experience with some clients, and when upgrading to a new version where templates were modified, your users may actually receive errors if they're attempting to use a quick save that was created in a previous version. So it's our recommendation that all quick saves are tested prior to go live on the new version. And that will just make sure that they're able to function and there's no errors with the new templates. If you do receive any error messages on the new templates, unfortunately, the only solution is to recreate the quick saves. So the next feature we're going to talk about, it sounds pretty similar to the one we just spoke of. This is the quick note functionality. And this allows a user to default several panels on the SOAP template. So now we're talking about the whole SOAP template and not just individual pop-up windows. So a quick note, this can contain information from places like the reason for visit, review of symptoms, physical exam, and even our assessment and plan panels. So when a user is setting a quick note, it's important to keep in mind that, kind of like our quick saves, any patient-specific fields, so for example, pain scale or onset, those will not be saved. These are supposed to be generic enough to be used with most patients. So these quick notes can be created by any user, but just like we saw with quick saves, they are tied in the system to a provider. So again, the quick notes are able to be selected, and that's based on the provider in the drop-down of the top toolbar. So when I'm actually going to save a quick note, I'm going to default it to save for all visit specialties by default. So the user does have the option, however, then to save it for only the specialties selected on the SOAP template at the time it was created. So with that set up and a quick note to be applied in the future, the same specialty has to be selected on the SOAP template prior to seeing it to pick it from the list. So if this doesn't sound like a feature that you want for your practice, you do actually have the ability to disable the ability to create and use quick notes. And this is at the practice level, and this is done in the practice configuration system practice template. And something I want to point out that you should keep in mind when applying quick notes is that if they've started documenting on the SOAP template at all, and then they go to apply the quick note, any data currently entered is going to be overwritten once it's applied. So I would highly recommend that users apply the quick note first and then begin documenting. So to create a quick note, a user would just fill out the SOAP template, with any of that needed non-specific patient data. And then there are actually two quick save buttons, so it just depends on where the user is on the screen. So one is located at the top of the page of the SOAP template, and the other one is at the bottom. So then the user would click save, and then they would enter their default set name and click add. So quick note data can then be populated by clicking the apply button, and that's located at the top of the SOAP template. Once all that pre-filled data is populated, then the user can go in and fill in any patient-specific details or make any modifications. So it's important to note that if any physical exam findings have already been documented on the template, the system will actually not even allow a user to apply a quick note. They'll receive a pop-up error. So this is another reason for our previous recommendation that really these quick notes should be applied first before documentation is done. So as I mentioned previously, the quick note functionality is only available on the SOAP template. So if a user would like to expand upon their documentation, so not only SOAP, but they also want to include other visit templates, there is the ability to save one quick note, and it will include defaults from all templates. So how this works is after documenting all the non-patient details on all the necessary templates, the user would click save, and then under the templates to save section, there's a radio button there that actually allows them to choose additional templates other than the SOAP. So in order for this feature to work when they go to actually apply them, they will need to have all of those templates open, and then they can apply. If they don't, if they didn't open a template beforehand, that data is unable to populate. So for most saved quick notes, modifications can be made, if down the road they realize that they want to make changes. So this is done by actually applying that quick note. You can make any of the changes necessary and then click save. The name of that previously saved quick note is selected, and then the user would click update. So you may have noticed I said most quick notes can be modified, not all. So it's important to note that if data is saved in a quick note, for multiple templates other than just the SOAP template. So let's say you have SOAP and then you also have a different template. This quick note cannot be modified down the road. So when that quick note name is selected from the grid of the Save Templates default window, the option to update would actually be grayed out for the user. So if any changes need to be made, if they want to update that quick note, they will have to create a new quick note and the old one can be removed from the system. So like we saw with our quick saves, provider access to quick notes can be modified on that system practice template. It's that template default setup. And from this template, you can also remove provider access to quick notes. So the next default in the EHR that we're going to look at is my phrases. So these are common phrases that can be used in several places in the EHR. So we see these used a lot in things like the generic HPI template, our AP details, and we even have the ability to use them as sign-off comments in the orders module, and that will depend on your version. So my phrases, they are specific to the pop-up or template that the provider is in when the phrase was saved. So for example, a provider goes in, creates a phrase in the patient plan section of the AP details window. That phrase will only be available to be used in the future in that section. So this is just to kind of help narrow down that list of phrases to only the ones that are applicable to where the provider is documenting at that time. So new My phrases can be created anywhere in the EHR where they're available to be used. So for example, a provider can navigate to the AP details window and click Manage My phrases. Under the phrase summary, that's where they would enter just a quick description that will make it easy to identify the phrase from a list. And then they would type in the phrase itself, and then the provider would click Add. And it can be easy for a long list of My phrases to accumulate, as you can imagine. So a really detailed naming convention is recommended. So for example, a lot of times we see that they'll require the provider to put their initials and then a short description. So something like back pain patient instructions. So to actually use those My phrases, the provider would go to the desired section that they want to document in and click My phrases. From the list, they would choose the phrase that they need. And actually multiple phrases can be selected for one section if necessary. So then any patient-specific details can be added. And one thing I've noticed that I thought was kind of a good idea is some providers will actually include a blank where patient-specific data should be entered. And that just kind of helps to remind themselves to document that piece of information in the future. So if a provider wants to take an existing phrase and use it as a basis for a new phrase, there is actually a copy phrase checkbox. So we find that on the Manage My Phrase window, and that's just going to allow the current phrase to be kind of tweaked and updated, and then save it as a brand new phrase. You can also, when you're doing that, you can update the phrase summary, which again, that's a little description, or the phrase type if you want to use that phrase in a different place in the EHR. So if you have a new provider or even an existing provider that maybe doesn't have a lot of My phrases, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. The custom DB pick list system practice template can be used to make several modifications to My phrases. So there is a My phrase panel, and under there, phrases can be copied from one provider to another. The provider then who they're copied to can actually use Manage My phrases within the EHR, and they can make any updates or remove unwanted phrases as needed. This template can also be used to remove the My phrase from the system for all providers. So several of our clients have experienced a known issue with the system practice template when it comes to copying phrases. So I just wanted to make you guys aware of that. So if that provider already has a phrase saved under the phrase type, so for example, patient plan, then that provider's name is not going to show in the list if you're trying to copy a different phrase under the same phrase type. So in my example, if I tried to copy a phrase with that same patient plan phrase type, that provider's name isn't even going to show as an option. So this is a known issue, and it has been marked as in progress by NextGen. So if users at your practice are finding themselves routinely sending the same task over and over in different templates, they can actually save themselves some time and clicks, and that's can be done by creating quick tasks. So quick tasks can be created in a variety of places, so things like AP details, My plan, a common one I see is referral orders. So these quick tasks, they can be created to be location specific. So, if your group has a lot of locations, this might help to kind of narrow it down. So basically, this works by a location is selected in your quick task setup window, and then it's going to filter the list of task recipients by location. And so that user location is actually pulling from the preferred locations that you have set up in System Administrator. So again, that's just going to kind of help to ensure that tasks are being sent to the correct user or group. So if a user would like to create a quick task, they'd begin by opening the template or pop-up, and then next to the quick task button is a configuration icon. In this window, they're going to enter all the task details, so things like recipient, subject, description. And when actually creating these quick tasks, keep in mind that a user can only have one quick task per source. So what that means is that a user can only have one task for, let's say, the referrals template. The recipients and the message are going to be the same each time I send a task from that template. So tasks can be set up to go to a work group, and that can kind of help with making that quick task generic enough for use on multiple patient charts. So now that we've reviewed several defaults that are possible in NextGen, let's take a look at some of the favorites that users can use when searching for the same items over and over. So the first feature we're going to look at is medication favorites. So with our medication favorites, a provider can create categories of their most commonly prescribed medications. So this can really save a lot of time. So instead of having to search for that same medication each time they go to e-prescribe it, they can just select it from a list. In addition to saving those favorite medications, providers can also actually save custom SIGs. And the system actually learns over time, and it'll start selecting that custom SIG instead of requiring the provider to change it each time. So these medication favorites lists can be shared among providers. So the categories can be all set up at once, and then all providers at your practice can reap the benefits. So I do want to point out, if your practice uses the formulary search functionality in the medication module, medication favorites will not be an option to be used. So to create our medication favorites groups and start adding our medications, a provider would need to click Prescribe New from the medication module. So this can be done as medications are being prescribed with real patients, or the provider can open a test patient and quickly create medication groups that can be used in the future. Once a provider has created those medication favorites groups, there are a few options to make the groups a little more user-friendly. The first is the ability to rename groups. So to do that, a provider would right-click on the tab and select Rename Group. The groups can also be reordered, and this is done by dragging and dropping them in that medication search window. So to start compiling that list of medication favorites, from that medication search window, the provider would search for the medication, and then they would drag and drop it into the desired group. So once a medication has been added to a favorites group, the SIG, along with some other details, so things like the quantity, can actually be modified for that particular medication and saved. So that's really going to allow the provider to customize each medication and then truly be able to prescribe it without having to make changes each time. So as I mentioned on a previous slide, the medication favorites can be shared with other providers. So this is done using the Copy Provider MedList utility. Those favorites lists can be shared, so with one or multiple providers, just depending on your needs. And then from this utility, you also have the option to remove favorites lists from providers. So in addition to saving time by using medication favorites, providers can also create custom SIGs. So these custom SIGs are created when that edit SIG option is used while prescribing a medication. These custom SIGs will show in the SIG dropdown under the first data bank options. These custom SIGs can be removed from the list if needed. So as a provider starts to use the custom SIG more and more, the system will actually remember that, and they will default that custom SIG over the out-of-the-box first data bank SIG. So it kind of saves them a little bit of time. Something providers should keep in mind, though, when you are creating custom SIGs, if the SIG is free typed, so instead of using those SIG builder drop-down lists, they just type it out, that custom SIG will not be able to be saved for future use. So in addition to medication favorites, users can create diagnosis favorites, and that's going to help them quickly pull those commonly used diagnosis codes. So these diagnosis favorite groups can be shared among users, and as a practice, you can also create diagnosis categories, and those can be assigned to providers. So something to note for this section, I will be discussing diagnosis favorites as it relates to NextGen's out-of-the-box diagnosis code lookup window, the one that's on your screen right now. There are diagnosis favorites for IMO, but that works a little separately than what we're going to be discussing today. So diagnosis favorites groups can be created from the diagnosis code lookup window. So under the favorites header, a user would click the plus sign, and that's going to add a group. That group name can be changed by double-clicking on the default group name. Once those diagnosis favorite groups are created, commonly used diagnosis codes can be added, and a user can do that by just searching in the window. Once they found the code they want, they can right-click on the code, and it's going to give the user the option to add that diagnosis to a favorites group. So now the next time a user is searching the diagnosis code lookup window, they can select the favorites header first, and then it's going to narrow their search down to only those favorited diagnosis codes. And when using a favorites group to search for a diagnosis code, it's important to note that only the first 100 diagnosis codes will display in the grid at a time. It's just a matter of space. So even though only the first 100 will show at a time, if you're searching, the entire favorites group will still be searched, so don't worry about that. It's our recommendation to kind of organize diagnosis groups maybe into smaller groupings than 100, just to avoid any confusion. So if I want to actually add that favorited diagnosis code from our Add Update Assessment window, the user can utilize the My Favorites section. So the section is going to allow you to just sort those favorites, so you can actually sort through the groups to make it a little easier to find the code you want. And you can also actually search using the filter feature. So once that favorited diagnosis code is selected, if that add assessments on one click isn't enabled, you can click Add Update like you normally would to add that diagnosis to the grid for today's visit. So like we have seen with most of our other features, diagnosis favorites list can be shared between users. So this is done in the Copy User Preferences window, and that's within the EHR. So diagnosis favorites from a user can be shared, and you can choose either an individual user or even groups. And if a user does have existing diagnosis favorites, you'll be given the choice to either overwrite or combine those favorite lists. So another method to create diagnosis favorites list is to use what's called diagnosis categories. So these categories are going to be groupings of similar diagnoses. So for example, you see a lot of times like contraception or maybe asthma. And these are created at the practice level, and then they're actually assigned to individual providers. So these diagnosis categories are created in file maintenance in our diagnosis category master file. So similar to our diagnosis code list we just saw, you can group these into different categories to make them a little easier to search. When creating these categories, you do have the option to designate if they're going to be used in just the EHR, just PM, or both. So after you create those practice diagnosis categories, they do need to be assigned to individual providers, and that's done in the provider's master file. The categories within that master file can actually be reordered, and that's going to allow you to display the most commonly used categories first in the list. So if your organization does have more than one practice, and you want to share these diagnosis categories among them, you'll want to make sure that you configure that practice access in that master file. So another area in the EHR where favorites can be beneficial is in the orders module. So order test favorites can be created to group commonly ordered lab and radiology tests, and that's really just going to save users time when they're searching in the orders module. So these order test favorites, they're created at the system level, and then they can be applied in a few ways. So to providers, the practice, and you can even have specialty specific categories. So the favorites list, they can be set up for the NextGen compendium test codes and even for specific vendors. So for instance, like LabCorp or Quest. And some vendors actually even supply their own test favorites lists. So those are downloaded along with the compendiums in your orders management console. So order test favorites, they're created in a system master file, and the lists are specific to the system that is being used for the code. So basically, this just means that when you are searching for NextGen compendium test codes, vendor test codes, or both, it's going to filter those lists and just make it a little easier for you to find the specific codes you need. These favorites lists are also divided by order type. So, for instance, lab versus radiology. So once our order test favorites groups are created, they can be assigned in a few places. So the first way is to assign these favorite groups to a provider. So in the provider master file, you would go to the orders module tab and you click the folder under that test favorites section. So you do this for each provider. The second way is at the practice level. So in the practice master file under the orders module tab, you would go to the lab RAD subtab, and then you would assign those favorite groups. And again, that would be for use at the practice level. The final option when assigning order test favorites is by specialty. So this is done in the specialties master file, and each specialty description that is added here is actually going to become a category that then can be used in the orders module. So when creating a new lab or radiology order, the test favorites will be available under the select test section. So favorites can be selected based on things like provider settings. If you're looking by practice, it'll be under that show favorites dropdown. Or even if you want to look by specialty, you'll find that under the by category dropdown. So you may have noticed that if you're looking in each of the steps above that I mentioned each time unchecking the Use NextGen Compendium checkbox. So I do want to note that this may or may not be a step that users have to take, and that all just depends on your practice's specific settings. So if your practice has the preference to use NextGen Compendium for new lab or radiology orders turned off in practice preferences, so as in you're not using the compendium, but you don't have any preferred performing entities selected, then this checkbox will continue to default in the orders module. So according to NextGen, this is working as designed, and I know I get this question a lot. So the reasoning behind it is that without defaulting the system to look at that NextGen compendium, it basically needs to know what other compendium it should be pointing to, so a specific vendor, like LabCorp. So currently, if your practice doesn't use the NextGen compendium and you don't want your users to have to continually uncheck that preference, then you will have to default a preferred performing entity. So the last time-saving feature that we will review for the EHR is used when you're composing and responding to patient portal messages. So standardized messages can actually be created to make sure that there's consistent messaging within your practice, and it also can stop users from having to type the same response over and over back to patients. So these standardized messages can be created by a user just for individual use, or even at the practice level, and it can be used by all users. These standardized messages are sorted into categories, and that's just going to kind of make it a little easier to find a specified message. So typically these categories are broken down by the different messages you may receive or be responding to, so things like appointments or billing. So as I mentioned, a user can create their own standardized messages, and that's done under the customized header within the patient portal message window. So by right-clicking on that customized header, users have the ability to create new categories and then also create those new standard responses. So if a user wants to add in any practice or patient-specific data fields, so some common examples are things like maybe the practice name and phone number, or maybe a patient name for the grading, they can do this by actually right-clicking on the template. So this can allow more personalized messages, but it doesn't require the user to go in and type this information each time. So if you at your practice are concerned about maybe consistent messaging, or you just want to save your users some time, you can create these standardized messages at the practice level as well. So these are created in the online practice settings master file that's located in file maintenance. And the message categories and standard responses, those can be created by right-clicking on the standard responses header. So as we saw with our user-created standard message, practice and patient-specific data fields can be added for our practice-level messages as well. So when I'm composing, a new patient portal message or even responding to a message, both my user and practice standard responses can be inserted. So a common concern that I hear from a lot of practices when using these standard responses, if you have patient and practice-specific data fields, you may notice that the data for patient-specific fields will not actually display in the message preview. So this can be kind of confusing because the practice-specific fields do update. So a lot of times people think there's a problem. So you can see from the example on the slide that in this example, the patient first name and patient last name fields, they're actually showing the macros instead of the actual data, like the patient's actual name. So this is working as designed according to NextGen. And don't worry, even though it doesn't show here, these fields will populate with the patient information on the actual message the patient receives, and if you save it to the patient's chart. So I hope you found some of those new features and some of the tips, and you can bring those back to your practices and to make documenting in the EHR a little bit easier. So next, I want to explore some of the ways that you can utilize default and favorites in the PM application, and this can help save clicks and maybe even possibly prevent mistakes. So the first feature is one that I find a lot of practices are not aware of, and this feature is session settings. So session settings can be used to remind a user to do certain things. So things like set an active batch, enter a process state that's going to apply for all charges, and even select the correct service location. So this can be accessed at any time, and that's from the task menu within PM. But individual users can also choose to set this window to launch each time they log in. So one of the first options is session settings is the ability to set an active batch. So as I'm sure you're aware, if a user logs out and logs back in, their batch will have to be set as active again. And missing this step can cause some problems. Let's say your front desk staff is supposed to be collecting co-pays as part of the autoflow process. If they forget to set that active batch, they're not going to be prompted with that transaction window. The service date and the process date can also be defaulted from this window. And this default date will be entered onto all charges during that session. So, I've seen a lot of times if your practice enters charges manually and it's typically a day or two behind, it may be your policy that you update that process date for AR reporting purposes. So if a user needs to remember to go back and select this date each time, that could be easily missed. And trust me, I've witnessed firsthand having to go back and update that process date for all charges is not a good time. Another option is the default batch info. So if this feature is enabled for your practice, that batch info note entered here will go on to all charges for the session. And that final option is to suspend that PM and EHR sync, and that will be just for the session. So another default in the PM application is allowing the default of rendering referring physicians. So this is added to the patient's chart, and it can save time when creating new encounters on things like scheduling appointments. So as you can imagine, if the rendering referring physician is not consistent for your patients, having these defaulted could actually potentially create more work and cleanup later on. So if this is something that your practice doesn't want users to be prompted to use, you can actually turn that off in practice preferences. And something else to keep in mind, if you're viewing the patient's providers on the EHR side, if defaults for these two features exist in the patient chart, neither provider is actually automatically added to that patient provider panel of the patient demographics template in the EHR. So that could be a big issue if your practice relies on this template. Now in the EHR, you're still able to see those by opening up that modified patient information window. And NextGen has recognized this as a known issue and they're currently working on it. So if your users consistently enter similar notes throughout the PM application, they may benefit from what's called user notes descriptions. So these are very similar, they're kind of like my phrases for the EHR. They're created and can be used in PM, EHR, and even in document management. The notes are created for a specific user, but they can be copied between users. The notes are copied within the user notes description master file, and you'll be prompted whether to merge or overwrite an existing user's notes. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, these user note descriptions are created for each individual user. And this is done in that user note description master file. Something to keep in mind when you're creating and then later on using these user notes is there is a 40 character limit. So when creating new user notes, it will allow you to enter more than 40 characters, but you'll notice as soon as you save it, it's going to be cut off. So one of the places that user notes can be applied is in a chart note. So from the clinical history and notes tab of the patient chart, the user can create a quick note. On that pop-up, there'll be arrows, and that will allow user notes to be added to both the subject and the note fields. So this functionality only works, also works for encounter notes. So from the patient chart, under that encounter tab, the user can create a new encounter note, and again, they can use those arrows to add notes to both the subject and the note fields. When applying those user note descriptions, it is possible to add multiple notes at a time for both the subject line and the note entry field. So this can really be beneficial when trying to fully capture the message of the note. This is going to save users a lot of time instead of having to constantly type this message again and again. And my little assistant, she's one slide behind. So sorry, we'll change that slide, but these slide decks do come out. So another place that user note descriptions can be utilized in PM is within marketing plan comments on the chart details window. So user note descriptions, they can be selected here from the drop-down window, and in this case, only one user note can be used at a time. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, there is a 40 character limit for user note descriptions. So this is a factor when you're trying to add multiple user notes. So I can add the multiple user notes, but it will be limited to only 40 characters. So the final feature that we're going to review in PM is the ability to create saved searches in the Worklog. So if a user finds that they're consistently using that same search criteria to find tasks, they can actually default those as a saved search. These are user specific and need to be created by each user. So to create a new saved search, the user would just enter the search criteria they wish to save, and then they would click the save button. That saved search is named and then is ready to be used on future searches. So using a saved search in the Worklog is as simple as selecting the search from the dropdown and clicking find. The results based on your search criteria will display in the window. So if a user creates a saved search and then they later want to go ahead and modify that saved search, they would just select the search from the grid, make any changes as needed, and click save. The user would then enter the same name and they'll actually be prompted to overwrite that existing search. A potential issue with saved searches being modified that has been reported is that a user may receive a pop-up to overwrite and replace a saved search, even if they don't have that saved search themselves. This is because that a search with that same name exists for another user in the system. If the user selects yes, they will actually overwrite the saved search for the other user. So this is a known issue and it is in progress. So NextGen basically just recommends if a user gets this pop-up, say no and use a different name for the search. So that concludes the defaults and favorites we'll review for the PM application. So hopefully you picked up on a few ideas you can take back to your practices. So now I'm going to turn it over to Cindy, and she's going to walk you through the defaults and favorites for document management.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lexi. Okay, so an often forgotten area of the system is document management defaults and favorites, and we're going to touch on just a few of those that might be helpful as you're managing your documents and filing them. The first one we're going to talk about is the custom chart. So much like Save Searches feature that Lexi just reviewed in the PM Worklog, custom chart in document management can save your users from having to enter the same search criteria over and over. These predefined searches are set up by the individual user based on search criteria that is useful for them. To create a custom chart configuration, the user would simply open the user preferences within document management, and then under the custom chart configuration section would click New from the menu button. After naming the configuration, the user would enter any search criteria they want to save. Each user can set up multiple search configurations if needed. So once you've actually configured this, you want to begin using it. So it can be used quickly to find subset of images. From the main toolbar in document management, the user can click the custom chart icon. The search results window will populate all the results based on the custom chart criteria selected. If the user has more than one configuration, you can toggle between them in the search results window. Within the custom charts result window, the columns can be reordered and removed to help with viewing results. So you can move things up and down. As an example, you might want to move the patient first and last name fields further up in the list as opposed to lower, and so on and so forth. The purpose of this is just to be able to minimize scrolling in the criteria that you're looking at. If we look at quick file configurations, it's another time-saving feature from document management. And the quick file configuration allows a practice to predefine filing information based on document type. These configurations are created at the practice level, and then the individual users can select a default quick file configuration. There are three parts to setting up these configurations. The first is the quick file hotkeys master file. The second is the quick file configuration master file. And finally, the default quick file configuration So let's start with the quick file. Creating quick file hotkeys. The quick file hotkeys contain pre-configured filing information. They will fill in all of the pre-filled information needed. The setup window mimics the filing screen we see in document management. Each hotkey is associated with one document type. In this example, we filled out the default filing information for CT scans. So as an example, you would be able to set this up and then move forward from there. The next step would be to group the quick file hotkeys you've created into the quick file configurations. These groupings actually allow the user to sort hotkeys based on documents or images that might be filed at the same time. Assigning quick file configurations to practices. So once you've set this up, you want to assign it to the practices. If the quick file configuration should be practice specific, you can enable enterprise preference for the practice access. This is done in enterprise preferences by enabling practice access for quick file configurations. Within quick file configurations, the master file, you can then open practice access and determine which practices are able to use each configuration. The final step before we can move on is being able to see the quick file configurations that the practice has set up. We have a default configuration set up user preferences. The configuration that is chosen will be defaulted by, the configuration that is chosen will be selected by default on the filing window. Our screen's moved a little bit quicker, so I'm kind of improvising here. All other quick file configurations available to the practice will also be available in the drop-down menu. So sorry about that. We've got a little bit delay, so I'm not really showing the screen. So as we move forward to utilize the quick file configurations, a user would open the filing window and select the patient for the current page of the document. The quick file configuration selected in user preferences will then display by default. The user would select the quick file hotkey that matches the document type on the first page. If all required fields for that document type have been filled in, the page will be filed and the process can be repeated with the remaining pages. This saves quite a bit of time in filing and makes a lot of the multiple entry easier. It also can reduce in efforts with user error, getting in the wrong spot. If a user is filing a multiple page document, it is possible to use the same hotkey several times. It is also possible to use multiple quick file configurations if needed. So within the same document, you can use others. Depending upon the required fields for your practice's document types, the use of quick file configurations could allow a large multi-page document to be filed with a single click. And that's something that really can move things forward very quickly. And as we all know, the redundancy needed in these filing options is somewhat can be a lot of a challenge. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. As I said, the document management, there's not a lot of defaults that you can do in there, but some of those can save quite a bit of time. But if you look at all of the features that we've demonstrated today, we want to show you how happy these clinicians are and how much time they use the defaults and favorites along with your staff. Now, we agree that this is an excessive display, and if you ever find a physician that is actually using this or is this happy with his EHR system, then we have developed a secret sauce. But we hope we've come up with a few options that will make life a little bit easier for you and move forward. So if you're uncertain where your practice stands, let iTentive help. We can help you by assessing your current readiness. We can look at some of the things that we've described today and help you implement those. We can also provide recommendations, and we can assist with the implementation of new processes and procedures. Next steps, you can visit us at iTentive.com. You can sign up for our informative webinars and blog. Consider our 3-day fixed price on-site consultations to review clinical workflow, revenue cycle, and front office, technology and performance, and then you can test drive any of our products. So now we'll open it up for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Cindy. And again, thank you everybody for joining us today. If you have questions, you can use the questions area of the webinar control panel, and we're just going to go through them in the order that we've received them. So let's start with the first one. Will you please send out a PowerPoint after the call? Absolutely. I will send out an email within the next week with a link to the recording and the slides. You'll be able to download from there. So keep your eyes out for that. If for some reason you don't see it in your email within the next week, you can always find our previous webinars on the events and education page of our website as well. Next question. What version is this used with in NextGen? Cindy?
I think our slides were demonstrated from version 5.9.3 and 8.4.3, but many of these functionalities have been in NextGen for a long time, so it's not version specific. There may be different things that, particularly known issues that may apply for different versions, but honestly, most of the things we hear, if you're in the if you're actually, Lexi, what do you think? I mean, I think if you're anything from 5.8 and up, most of these will work, but 5.9, anything in the 5.9 series, these are covered.
Lexi, I think you might be muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, yeah, I would agree with Cindy that the majority of these have been around since 5.8. There are a handful here and there that have been added since UD3 or maybe later, but the majority are available.
Great, thank you both. Next question. The modifying of quick saves doesn't work. It's broken. The update button doesn't work. The last I was told, you will have to name it differently.
So yeah, Chelsea, I can take this one. I would say, yeah, it's possible that with your version, maybe you are unable to. So yeah, if you are unable to do that, renaming it would really be the only solution.
Great, thank you, Lexi. Next question. Quick saves. Does this mean the nursing staff should apply the quick note prior to entering vitals, as the nurse would see the patient prior to the provider?
So vitals wouldn't really be included in that. When I should specify when I'm talking about documenting the SOAP template, I'm more referring to things like, going in and adding maybe a reason for visit and some physical exams and then trying to use the quick note. So things like vitals, that's flowing over from your intake template, so that wouldn't apply. It's more the provider's documentation is what I was referring to. That's a great question.
Great, thank you, Lexi. This one I think that we've covered with the presentation, but I'll go ahead and ask it anyways. Are there quick saves for PM or only EHR? So I think that we covered that and showed that there are, in fact, different uses like this that you can use in PM and document management as well. Anything to add to that, Lexi?
Yes, so quick saves per se, as far as the documentation, not exactly, but yeah, as Chelsea mentioned, there are different variations of that where you can default information in PM and document management as well.
Perfect, thank you. And it looks like at the moment this might be our last question. So if you have questions, get them in. We'd be happy to answer them. Can I save a family history using quick notes? For our first spouts physical examination for children, this is very specific and complex. Sorry, first sports physical exam for children.
Okay. Yeah, so you can definitely save anything like that. I would say the one caveat being what I mentioned was just it is difficult. You need to make it generic enough to be applicable. So no really like patient-specific information, but if there's anything that you're noticing, is pretty consistent, you're documenting each time, you can definitely create a quick note for that, and you could name it, sports physical, and then it will just save some time. So even, obviously you're going to have to go back and do some documentation regardless, but it can help maybe create like a baseline to start from.
Great. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. If you have questions after the webinar ends and you go, oh, I forgot to ask one, looks like we got another one come in, so I'll answer that in a second too. But you see everybody's information up on the screen. Basically, find a way to get a hold of us, and we're happy to help, whether you reach out to Lindsay, Lexi, Cindy. You can always reply back to my emails when I send them out with a link to the recording. Any way you can get a hold of us, we're happy to help. That's what we're here for, so make sure that you ask them. And it looks like there was an update to that question, Lexi. Will it show up in family history portion of the note?
So family history is not one of the panels. So it's more used for things like review of systems and reason for visit and things like that. Just because that history is so specific. There are things you might be able to default in other ways, but yeah, I would say it's more for that generic visit, questions you review typically during a physical.
Is there a way to create a preset for sports family medical history?
Oh, sorry, I think I was muted there.
Yep, you were.
Yeah. I would say, yeah, there's not really a lot of defaults as far as that information with it being so specific. I would say you could default a lot of the other information and then go in and fill that information out for the patient.
Okay. Well, does anyone have anything else to add before we close this one down for today? Okay, thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope you have a great week. And again, keep your eyes out for our future webinar invitations as well as the recording to this one. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.